Please be seated. It's common wisdom that you can't change other people's minds. I feel like there's been a lot of chatter in the media recently about whether people can change their mind, say or believe one thing or vote one way, and then years later say or believe or do something else. Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw said, "Those who cannot change their mind cannot change anything." And there's an old proverb, "A wise man changes his mind, a fool never will." And as school begins again, I'm reminded that minds do change, very literally. Developmentally, the mind of a 3-year-old is so different from a 6-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 15-year-old, 18-year-old, 21-year-old. And I'm aware in my middle age that my mind is different than it was a decade ago, and then it will be a decade hence. As adults, we learn how our minds work is related to our routine and how we live. For me, church is a huge part of my routine. Sunday mornings always remind me why I'm grateful, and it takes me out of the bubble of my mind to see all of you. I feel like I need church and Jesus and community as much or more than ever. And I am so happy to see all of you here today. The stories in today's gospel are part of a pair. And the first features the only character in the entire Gospel of Mark to best Jesus in an argument and change his mind. Let me set the scene. We're halfway through the Gospel of Mark, and Jesus is trying to have some alone time in Tyre, beyond the borders of Galilee, the northernmost spot that Jesus visits in this Gospel. Jesus didn't want anyone to know he was there, yet could not escape notice. She finds him in a home where he's staying. A Syro-Phoenician woman who is not named but is clearly identified as a Gentile. She came and she bowed before him and she begged him to heal her daughter. An unknown woman from a different religion and background coming to ask him for a favor would have been shocking in Jesus' time. And Jesus' response to her is harsh. He says, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." I read a lot of takes on this gospel this week, including a few that point out that urban Gentiles generally had more resources than Galilean peasants. But however you read it, this is a hard no and not Jesus' finest moment. "Yes, Lord," she reverently replies, "but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Touché. For this reply, for this saying, Jesus says, "The demon has left your daughter." Lindsay Freeman, wife of our former rector Len Freeman, in her book, Bible Women, All Their Words and Why They Matter, notes that this woman speaks only 11 words in this gospel. But she believed that even a wee bit of Jesus' power, even the leftovers, would heal her daughter. An example of faith in Jesus that is so deep and so desperate that she's willing to go out on a limb to break social norms. She returns home to her child, and the demon is gone. For this family, everything has changed. Their life, their faith, their hearts, and their minds. In the second story, a man is brought to Jesus by people referred to as they. He is also a Gentile, unable to hear or communicate. He is deaf and mute. Jesus takes him aside, puts his fingers in his ear and his own saliva on his tongue. These are intimate acts. And then he looks up to heaven and he sighs and he says, Ephphatha, Aramaic for be opened. It's interesting that this line, spoken to a Gentile in a book written for a Greek audience, retains this word from Jesus' mother tongue. There are certain words, even in other languages, that communicate something in a way that doesn't always translate. Other languages can open other pathways in our mind. And as a side note, today we're switching to a new form of the prayers of the people with the response Kyrie eleison, which is Greek for Lord have mercy, and we're just going to practice it. So try it, say it after me. Kyrie eleison. Kyrie eleison. Great. Okay, back to our story. Jesus heals the man, and he began to speak clearly. Jesus says, don't tell anyone, but they proclaimed it more zealously. How could they help themselves? They were astounded beyond measure. The Greek is hyper perisos exceplesanto. Perisos means abundant or excessive. It's the same word in John 10 when Jesus says, I have come that they may have life and may have it abundantly. Here, the people experience overwhelming, hyper-abundant amazement. And they go tell everyone about this Jesus who does all things well. Sometimes being totally overwhelmed is what it takes to change our mind. Sometimes our mind changes in a moment, and other times it evolves. And our faith, too, can change in an instant or in stages. Brian McLaren, a pastor, author, and public theologian whom I worked with on a few projects in the late 2000s, wrote a book published in 2021 called Faith After Doubt: Why Your Beliefs Stopped Working and What to Do About It, in which he talks about stages of faith that move from simplicity to complexity, often in our early life, and then perhaps into perplexity, and hopefully on to harmony. I love this passage. Like a fallen tree in the forest, or like last year's composting leaves, what was dying was becoming soil, fertile soil. I felt that in the decomposition of failed or failing ideas, concepts, or beliefs about God, a deeper faith was taking root. And from that soil, a new sense of God was emerging and arising as well. We believe that minds can change and hearts can change. Your faith can change. Your life can change. My invitation to all of us this year is be opened to how God might be calling you to change. And I believe that when hearts and minds change here, in this congregation and this community with the hyper-abundance that is around us, it can have real effects on the world, for the poor and the vulnerable, for this planet, for the new and the next generation. The foundation of our faith is that we can be born again, that the dead will live again. In the words of Amazing Grace, written by John Newton, who was the captain of a slave ship and became an abolitionist, an Anglican priest, and a hymn writer, join me, friends. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Amen.